Very special thanks to Affordable Prestige Cars for providing the Jag in this review, and as you can kind of tell from a lot of the content that I've done with them on the channel, they do tend to specialise in Jags, first and foremost, XKs, XJs, XFs, etc. So if you are on the market for a Jag like that, especially a higher performance one, then of course give them a look, especially if you are in the southwest of the UK, so click the link right below this video in the description to check out their current stock. This review has been a long time coming. As many of you who have followed the Beards and Cars series will know, this is a very important review because I've already featured extensively the newer X150 shape. There are one or two variations that I haven't done, but including buying my own, I've had a pretty comprehensive experience with the newer XK and the XKR in particular. This one though is possibly the most requested car I've had to actually review on the channel, which I find interesting. It's a car with a lot of fan fervour. It definitely still sees a ton of love within its community, including the newer cars as well, such as in the owners forums that I'm a part of, owners clubs on Facebook for example, and other places as well. So the question is, primarily, how does this car stand on its own 2 feet, but of course, how does it compare to the new one? That's always the question that's going to come up, unless of course, like me, you don't really have options. If you already know that you either definitely prefer this one over the newer car, or in my case, already prefer the newer car over this one, in terms of stuff like the looks and the interior and, you know, used prices and all that kind of stuff, then you might want to stay open to comparing the two. Now, I'm going to get even further into that side of things when I most likely do an actual rival showdown within the series that's already featured the XK in a number of different episodes between this one and the newer car. So stick around on the channel for that, and of course a lot of you will be keen to see that one if you are in the market or are just fans of the XK. First of all though, how does it stand on its own? What is this car like as kind of a time capsule of the earlier 2000s? Coming of course originally from the 90s, this car began production in 96, the model year was 97 officially, ended in 2006 when they replaced it with the car that I purchased, the X150 shape, with of course the aluminium body, looks much more like an Aston DB9, whereas this car looks more like a DB7, and of course there's good reason for that, because it actually shares that car's DNA. It also shares some DNA and even the same engine spec as the XJR, and of course recently I reviewed the XJR on the channel as well. Now the very first thing that struck me about this car as soon as I got in is that it might be a little bit more snug than I originally anticipated whenever it does come around for me to review an actual DB7, because if it's anything like this car, it is snug with a capital S. This is super low, very sleek, and it has much more of a streamlined looking torpedo or cigar shaped body compared to the newer X150. The X150 has much more of a Fisker Karma kind of approach to its design, wherein the design is based on the hips and the way it flows around the large wheels, whereas this older car is much more about just the shape of the body, and the wheels are kind of more of an afterthought. They're just there, but most of what you're looking at is based on the shape of the pure body alone, with that really, as I said, streamlined torpedo-esque appearance. I can certainly see why some, especially older drivers, will think this has a prettier or more classic look. My thoughts are already out there in that regard. I have a clear favourite and that hasn't changed. This one though does have, for sure, a certain charm that even mine didn't have. The newer car feels to me more like a budget supercar, almost. It has tremendous presence on the road, sounds stunning, looks fantastic, unbelievable value for money, great handling. You know, it's a fantastic car. There is a reason why I bought one at the end of the day. This one to me has much more of like an old school British charm to it, where I would never accuse this of looking like a supercar. And of course there are some people who would disagree. To me this looks like more a modern interpretation of a 60s GT. This one to me feels and looks more like a modern day E-Type than mine did. And again, that will definitely lend itself more towards certain drivers than others. The interior is a very cozy place to be, and that has both upsides and downsides. I will say the interior is much more atmospheric and much more characterful than the newer car. It feels almost like you're sitting in a little gentleman's club. You've got the plush, thick, comfy leather seats, the real wood dash that envelops the car, these little interesting dials, or in the case of this car, which is a slightly newer one, that small center screen, and it does have a certain older charm to it where, even though this one is a 2003 car, it still kind of retains that 90s DNA. The payoff, though, as I alluded to at the start of the video, is space. If you are over 6 feet tall, I would strongly recommend looking into the newer car. The newer XK, I actually get asked this a lot on the channel. How tall am I? How much space is in the newer one? Well, to clear that up, I'm 6'3". The newer car, I believe, could easily fit somebody who's 6'7", 6'8". It literally has that kind of legroom and headroom. It's fantastic, even with the hard top. This one definitely doesn't compare to that. If you are over 6 feet, you are going to be snug in this car. As you can see from the side profile shots of me in the vehicle, I've got the seat as far back as it can go, pretty heavily reclined, and as you can see from where my knees are, they are pretty much on the dash. So I'm very grateful that this is not a manual car, because using that clutch would be an absolute pain. Snug, as I said, has its downsides. It's very atmospheric, and I will definitely say that the lower, more almost supercar-esque windscreen that you're looking out of does feel more charming than the newer car for sure. However, I would never sacrifice actually being comfortable for the sake of that, so if you're a more average height driver or anything up to 6 feet, you'll be fine. If you're over, then you might want to look into the newer one more so. Now in terms of performance, of course it's not as quick as the newer car, at least you'd hope not. The initial 90s cars of course share the V8 with the XJR. It's initially a 4 litre, and this was actually the first Jag to use the AJ V8. 4 litre, 370 horsepower in the case of the R, such as this one is. This one though is a newer car, a 4.2 V8, also supercharged of course, increased from 370 to 400 horsepower. Performance is strong, 0 to 60s around 5 to 5.5 seconds depending on who you ask. Limited to 155 unsurprisingly for top speed. Without the limiter, much like the newer car, you're looking at about 175 miles an hour. So it's certainly more than quick enough even by today's standards. Handling wise, it's very different to the newer car. The higher center of gravity, the fact that it's not quite as squat, it doesn't have that supercar stance that the newer one has, it is heavier as well, and plus just older technology in general, means that it does feel a little bit softer. Now the payoff to that is I would argue that if you are under 6 feet, as I said, and need more of a long distance GT, you may even like this one more than the new car, because it is smoother than the newer one. The newer XKR, and this is actually one of the things that I didn't like about it so much, reacts to everything on the road. Even if you drive through a small puddle, you can feel the car's steering pull toward the puddle, because it just has that kind of spot-on, very reactive steering, which is fantastic for performance, but it means that the car isn't necessarily as much of a cruiser as this one could be, which feels almost like a two-door XJ, in my opinion. A little bit firmer than that, but similar. More smooth, soaks up the bumps. The payoff and the disadvantage is that at higher speeds, it does float around a little bit more. It's not as sure of itself, and it's definitely not as precise, in my opinion, as the newer car is. So if you're going to push it hard around a track, absolutely go for the newer car. If you want something that's more of a long-distance GT and more comfortable, that you're not necessarily going to be flooring it everywhere, then this one might appeal to you a bit more. They're both very good in both regards, but they definitely have that slight edge over each other in different ways. In terms of space, this one is not a hatchback, whereas the newer one is. The trunk space is still good for what it is because it's not a small car. In fact, this is, though, smaller than the Maserati 4200 of the time, which is surprising to me because these Jags always looked kind of big and kind of long, but the Maserati is in fact bigger, if I recall correctly, and of course I reviewed that car on the channel as well. So if you are interested in a potential rival to this one, be sure to watch that video. And I may even do a rivals match between this car and that one, because that would be a nice follow-up actually to the video I did comparing the X150 to the Maserati Gran Turismo, kind of a new versus old Jag Mazda showdown. Now, in terms of fuel economy, just to touch on that briefly, I know a lot of people won't care. Probably you won't care even more so if you buy the R. If you cared, you'd probably get the XK8, for example. But incidentally, you're looking at officially 16 in the city, 31 on the motorway, 23 average, 4 miles per gallon. From what I could tell in owners' forums, most people get about 17 to 27 on average, which is quite a wide swath to be looking within, but it kind of makes sense. Some people are definitely more lead-footed than others. Again, depends what kind of driver you are. I will freely admit I'm much more of a cruiser when it comes to my own cars. I prefer to let the torque do the work and just kind of waft around enjoying the car and its presence, the looks, the sound. I don't really push my cars that hard, and I certainly don't aim to get the tail out through every corner, so it depends on your driving style. That means that the tank range, in the case of this one, is anywhere between about 280 and 450 miles, depending on how frugal you are. Again, very wide margin, but that really does depend on how quick you're going to go, how hard you're going to push it. In terms of values, definitely undercuts the newer car, which is no surprise at all. If you're going to look for an original 370 horsepower, like late 90s shape, you can get those for as low as like $5,000 if you're willing to go to 6-figure miles. It's a risk that you might want to take, and it certainly has even more of that classic charm if you want to get one of these, which incidentally had a facelift in 2002, which went up to that 4.2, and then a more major facelift in 2004, and you can definitely tell the difference with that facelift. This one, you're looking at about $8,000 entry point, about 10 to 12 average, and as high as, well, about 20-ish. You can even go higher if you go for one of the last cars, like a 2005, 2006 with the 4.2, 400 horsepower, the full-on facelift, like right before they changed it to the new car. And currently, you can pay as high as about $30,000 for one of those still, which is kind of nuts, considering that you can buy the newer one for less than that in many cases. Now, in terms of issues which these can face, of course, the newer one has its gremlins as well, and I've talked about, as I said, that before on the channel. As far as these, you want to be looking for the window seals, check the wheel arches for any corrosion. You want to be looking at timing chains on the older cars in particular, check for any rattling on the tensioner. 2002, they improved that, and then even more so in 2005. So again, that depends on the age of the car and the mileage. Check your gearbox oil if it has been done in particular. It's supposed to be one of those lifelong ones, but in reality, it should be done every 50 or 60,000 miles ideally. If it has never been done and you're a 6-figure mile car, you might want to reconsider. And again, the price will probably reflect that. Check for the ball joints, check for the wheel bearings, any kind of noise or rumbling while driving, any knocking as well. Again, for a car of its age, not too much of a surprise. Check the electrics, electric windows, the adjustable seats, the adjustable steering column, the trip computer in the case of these. These smaller things which can become gremlins over time. And interestingly, when it comes to these, don't necessarily think that low mileage means perfection, because it depends if the car has been standing somewhere for a long time. If it's a super low mile original, but has never really been driven at all and just kept outside, and not particularly cared for, just not driven, then that's not necessarily a good idea either, even in comparison to a super high mileage car. So ideally, I would say look for a car that has been driven, but has been doted on. So for example, when I purchased my current car, the Quattroporte, it's only had 2 owners, the mileage is not very high, and it's had a lot done to it in the past in terms of keeping it well maintained. That's the kind of thing you want to see, somebody who clearly has loved the car. If you find a Jag with a lot of receipts, but not necessarily many MOT failures, that's a great sign, because it means that people have got ahead of the game and fixed things or kept things up to scratch or improved them before they needed to be, rather than fixing them after. So again, it depends on how much value for money you want versus how much of a bargain you want. If you just want to go dirt cheap and, fix it on the cheap and aren't too concerned about it being a, Concurs winner, then sure, go cheap. If you want it to be perfect or your absolute baby, borderline show car, then of course you'll need to do a little bit more legwork and research. But that's fairly obvious and applies to most cars, especially a car of this caliber combined with this kind of age. Overall, my verdict on this car is I can actually definitely see why many owners, but especially from what I've seen older owners, like these more than the newer one. The visuals are all down to personal preference, of course, I will never like this car as much as the newer one when it comes to the looks, just because that's my preference. However, I do think this car has a ton of presence on the road. People definitely really like looking at it, much like the new one, but in a slightly different way. It does have much more charm. That is the single biggest compliment that I can give this car compared to mine. This generation, pre-facelift, post, all within the X100 series from 97 to 2006, has more charm than the newer car. It does feel like it has more personality and more of a classic vibe. As I said, that is a major thing, a major merit in its favour. Disadvantages for me would be that it's a little soft, it's a little bit wallowy at higher speeds compared to the newer car, it doesn't feel quite as precise, and the biggest downside for me is just the sheer interior space. So that'll very much depend on the size driver that you are. Overall, that's it for my thoughts. As I said, be sure to stick around on the channel because I will most likely be doing at least 2 showdowns that I mentioned between, first of all, this and the newer one, which of course you'll want to stick around for if you are on the market, and a showdown potentially between this and the Maserati 4200. But overall, that's it for my thoughts. If you are or were an owner of one of these, slap your stories and thoughts down below. Did you love it? Did you hate it? What things do you think you should look out for? Tell everyone down below, and if you are in the market, be sure to check out the comments for those stories and tidbits, and of course stick around on the channel for more. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.